Hi, I'm Alex Bolboaca, coming to you from Mozaic Works studio with another video about conclusions related to the first 6 months of interviews and conversations with interesting people from software development. As I mentioned, right now we did for 6 months, we had a lot of interesting conversations with people from different areas of software development, C++ or object-oriented programming pioneers, XP pioneers, extreme programming pioneers, or people who work in domains like Scrum and other things like that. And it's been very interesting to see a few trends which encouraged me to come to you with a few conclusions, a few things that I've learned from these conversations. And what I like to discuss this time is the difference between focusing on large scale and focusing on small scale in software development. And this seems to be something that has come up very early or relatively early in software development and is still present today. Let me explain what I'm talking about. So what happened, first of all, we had a few problems with software developments when we had to write code in Fortran or COBOL, and these programs grew and grew and grew, and we realized that we couldn't possibly manage. We couldn't remember anymore what was the connection between different data structures and different functions that were using those data structures. And therefore a new idea arose, which was how about combining functions with a data structure and therefore having encapsulation, and then having message passing between these things in order to allow for other types of simulations or for UI things. So this gave rise to object-oriented programming. And with object-oriented programming, a conference was organized called UPSLA. UPSLA was initially organized by Alan Worsbrock and a few other people, of course. But Alan is one of the people who we've interviewed. And out of UPSLA, there came a lot of interesting conversations about objects and how to group objects and how to have modeling for objects and so on. But kind of at the same time, something else happened. A new movement appeared, which ended up being called extreme programming. And so you have this difference between people who are trying to think large scale of, let's say you have a large enterprise. How do objects fit into a large enterprise? How do objects fit into a bank? And on the other hand, you have people who are saying like, let's look at the small scale. Let's look at the things that help us every day, every single day. And not so much about trying to figure out the perfect combination of objects, but figure out what are the techniques that help us get to a place where we have good combinations of objects or other types of design. And you can see these two currents happening at the same time between two different types of development. So on one hand, you have the design patterns movement or patterns language of programming, which is one of the oldest communities that is still active in software development. And that started from design patterns and pattern language inspired by Christopher Alexander's books on using design patterns in architecture. And you have this large-scale thinking of let's try to find patterns that fit multiple problems. You also get another type of thinking, which is how about we have a modeling language, and you have modeling languages coming up for different books or inside different teams. Rebecca Worsbrook mentioned that in her first book they used a kind of modeling language, and other people were using different modeling language. And so the idea was, after a while, to kind of unite this into one thing that ended up being called UML, Unified Modeling Language, because this is what it was doing. Now, what's interesting is that the plop community and the XP community were both active on the same platform. And the platform that enabled these conversations and these types of innovations was the first wiki created by Wirt Cunningham. Wirt Cunningham is somebody who is very proficient as an inventor. He created a lot of interesting things. But the wiki is one of the things that he's most known for. He also created a technical dead metaphor and a few other things. And Wirt Cunningham worked with Kent Beck at Tektronix. They worked together. They were kind of doing pair programming. They came up with a bunch of different ideas. And Wirt created his wiki, where people started to collaborate from all over the place and started creating, on one hand, design patterns, and on the other hand, discussing about extreme programming and about what will later be called extreme programming. And so it's interesting to see the difference between these two things and the different focus. So on one hand, if you discuss with people from extreme programming, and we had a few interviews with them, Jipo Hill and J.B. Rainsberger are two people who come from the extreme programming background. You realize that they were a very varied group of people. Jipo Hill mentioned that he didn't have a programming background. He learned programming and he learned many of the technical stuff by actually interacting with people at extreme programming communities. And they had a kind of rebel spirit in the sense that they were trying to, on one hand, they were trying to solve some real problems. JB mentions how he was writing code and getting a lot of bugs found in his code, and he got really tired of doing this ping pong with testers. So I'm writing some code, testers are noticing a bug, I have to write some more code, and so on and so forth. And he looked for a solution, and he found automated testing as that solution. And although he wasn't very good at writing tests because it was his first time, he managed to rewrite a project that he was working on, be ready on time, and not have bugs, or at least have very few bugs. So even without knowing the technique very well, he was still much better at solving this problem. But you notice the interesting thing is that this story is about a small problem, or a relatively small problem. It's not about designing an enterprise or something like that. And so you have this kind of people who come from different communities, come from different backgrounds. They get together, try to learn a lot of things. And it seems to me, and I may be wrong, by the way, in everything that I say in this video. I'm just sharing some of the things that I concluded, but my opinions may change once I interview more people. So it seems to me that there was a kind of rebellion in the XP community. They were trying to find new ways, better ways. They were looking for these solutions. And they were looking at techniques. They were looking at thinking small, but not thinking small in the sense of it only works for very small programs. Thinking small in terms of what are the things that can help me every day? What are the things that if I do day by day by day by day, they will help me provide results. And on the other hand, you have the people looking at objects and at enterprises and large products, and how can you match these products? How can you reuse code perhaps between products? All these kinds of questions that apply on a much higher level. And these naturally lead to unified modeling language, they lead to design patterns, and they lead to a few other things. And if you look at the people who are pioneers of object-oriented programmers, many of them have become software architects in time. Rebecca Worth-Brock is an example. Another example is Grady Butch, who I hope I will be able to have a conversation with. And they think about large-scale things. They think about, okay, we have this big problem. How can we possibly split it into smaller problems? How can we reuse stuff and so on? And so this gives rise to an interesting dichotomy. On one hand, you have these kind of techniques and tools like test-driven development, pair programming, and so on that work on a day-by-day basis, and that given enough time and given enough skill, you can actually have emergent design out of it. You can actually learn the design patterns by using these techniques. You can actually obtain or naturally grow towards various design patterns or larger scale structures. And on the other hand, you have the large scale view, which looks at, we have a big application, how can we split it? What are the rules for doing that? How can you partition it? And all these things. And there's a bit of friction between them, because at one point there were discussions that everything emerges, you don't need to do any architecture will just emerge, something that actually turns out it's not actually true. There are situations in which you can emerge a part of architecture, but it may take you a very long time. There are other situations in which you need to think about these things beforehand. One particular case is when you have multiple teams and you need to split the work between them in a way that is useful for an organization and that optimizes for good results, but at the same time for fast creation of software. And so my conclusion after listening to all this, I've always seen this difference because I've kind of been between the two worlds. I've been part of the software craft and I really like the extreme programming techniques. I wish more software development teams were doing extreme programming because it's a very, very useful set of techniques that can help you do a lot of great things and do them fast and so on. But I do not believe that you can do this without proper architecture, especially when you are talking about a larger effort or about very complex problems. And that's where I've been in the other world of carefully finding design patterns and carefully describing those design patterns, and perhaps providing those design patterns for your project, like design your design patterns beforehand for your project so that you optimize the development speed. And therefore, I'm kind of between these two worlds. And it's very interesting to see that this dichotomy is actually there, it has been there for quite a long time. But what's important about this is you shouldn't see them as completely separate. You can have some architecture done beforehand and then go into your XP team, develop it, and so on using XP practices. Both are valid, both are useful today, but the difference between the two is in the focus. And I believe that some people are more attracted to a lot of order and a lot of structure, and this is where these types of people will be more interested in design patterns, in how to think beforehand certain structures that help, in how to identify your modules and so on, and how to split big programs and how to reuse and all this stuff. So there is some kind of high-level thinking or large-scale thinking. And I believe there are some people who are much more interested in fast feedback. And fast feedback is awesome because you can actually develop using the XP techniques, using test-driven development. It's really rewarding to take a big problem and then go step by step, but knowing that at each step, every 15 minutes or so, you have something that works and you keep growing and growing and growing and growing. And this is awesome. It's a great feeling to do so. But at the same time, while this is very, very fun, I believe that sometimes you won't end up to, in case if you need a large solution, you won't end up with the best path towards that solution or the fastest path. And if you know more about the problem and if you think a bit beforehand, not months, not years, but a few days perhaps, or let's say a week if it's something really big, or 2 weeks if it's something really big, but not months, then you have a better chance of figuring out and of moving faster. And it's funny because if you try to discuss the alternate side with each of these sides, of course you get a few people who understand this and they are very much in sync with this vision. But there are also people who say, oh no, I'll just do my test-driven cycles and things will emerge, or I'll just think a lot beforehand and I will get to the perfect solution. And none of this is good. You need to find somehow middle ground. So that's it. You see, there's this dichotomy between kind of large-scale thinking and small-scale thinking. Both of them are good. Don't find the words small and large. I couldn't find better words. Don't let them turn you off from either of these things. Small is not better than large scale. Large scale is not better than small scale. Sometimes you need both. If you are in a startup, you probably can think small scale in a small startup. If you are in a large organization, in a large enterprise, you probably need to think both large scale and small scale. And even if you are in a startup that is growing very fast, you probably need to think large scale as well. So these are some of my conclusions from what I've learned. And the history is fascinating, and the history shows that these two things have kind of went on in parallel, and they make a lot of sense and they can work together, but you need to understand where each of them is appropriate, and you need to understand and experiment where each of them is appropriate. And you also need to understand yourself and what are your natural preferences. Am I more towards a strict order system or more towards a growing kind of system where I'm not looking further ahead, but I'm just focusing on the current step and just enjoying the feedback loop? Both of them are important. Both of them require practice, a lot of practice. And so the key thing here is actually, and my advice to you is, once you understand these two parallel things, try to practice both, because each of them will give you something useful. So try to practice design patterns, try to practice modeling using architecture and diagrams and so on, but also try to practice domain-driven design, which seems to be the evolution of large-scale thinking today. But also try to practice test-driven development in the style of emergent design. So don't think about the design that you're trying to obtain, but rather focus on every step, on one step at a time, and allow the design to emerge from what you're doing, and see the difference between them and learn when to apply each of them. While they are different and they require perhaps different mindsets, and you have a different proclivity for using one of them, they are not bad techniques, and you should learn them all. So if you find this interesting, you'll find more information in our conversations with Rebecca Worsbrook, where we discussed a lot about object-oriented programming and how to design with objects. With Joe Yoder, where we discussed about where design patterns came from and how patterns language of programming community has started and how it has grown to what it's today. With Alan Worsbrook, there's a part of the video where we discuss about how Wirt Cunningham and Kent Beck were working together on certain projects and innovating. With Jipo Hill and J.B. Reisberger, we discussed on how extreme programming has influenced them, has helped them, and what they believe about extreme programming today, and where extreme programming has gone, because you don't hear a lot about extreme programming, but it turns out that the ideas are still there. You just don't hear about extreme programming as a separate discipline. That's it. I hope you enjoyed this. We will come back with more videos. So until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.